Hi there, in this video we're going to look at two new things in HTMX. We're going to look at the hx push URL, which will allow us to change the URL when we load up new partials, and we're also going to look at how to do pagination and infinite scroll using HTMX. To change the URL, we can see that when we click to this detail view, the URL changes, and when we go back, it changes back. We're going to see how to do that, and you can see that by default, if I look at this page, we get 20 elements. And we can implement infinite scroll to keep loading up new sections of this page for as long as there's content. So let's dive into the code and see how to do this now. So let's start by adding an hx push URL attribute to allow us to change the URL when we go from the list page that you see here to the detail page. Now currently, as you can see, that doesn't happen. We go to the detail page, it's the same URL, and when we go back. So let's get started by looking at the film list component, and it's this anchor tag here that we're going to target, and this is what actually loads the detail view into our page. So we can add an hx push URL to this, and we can specify what is the URL we want to actually push to the browser history. So it's going to be /films, and then we want the actual name of the film to be in the browser's URL. So we'll put film.film.name in there. And now you should see that this actually hooks it up. So when we click Pulp Fiction, you see that that appears in the URL within our browser. Same if we click Escape from New York, you see that that appears. But one problem we've got is that when we go from the detail page back, we still have that in the URL. So we need to do it the other way as well. So if we go to Film Detail, I'm going to copy this attribute. Film Detail, and it's this button that we click here that takes us back to the list page. So we need to add hx push URL here. And this is just going to go to /films. So if we reload this page, we need to go back to the /films. Let's say No Country for Old Men. We see that appear in the URL. We go back and it's gone. So we're now able to go between the list page and the detail page. The URL changes, so it makes it look like there's actually another page being loaded in. So this kind of replicates React router functionality in React or Vue router. And this gives you a nice way to do this with HTMX. Very easy, and there's more you can do, and it works by interacting with the browser history object. But that's all we want to cover in this tutorial. Let's now move on to infinite scroll. So as you can see, I've generated a lot of films here. These have just got random names with 6 characters. I just did a bit of code in the Django shell to generate these. But what we have here is 126 films basically, and we want to paginate this and use infinite scroll to load up more components, or more films rather. So let's say if we wanted to paginate it by 20, we want to hit the 20th film, and then HTMX should dynamically send a request to get the next 20 films. So what we're going to do is wire that up in this video. So the first thing to do is we want to go to our views.py, and we have this film list that's responsible for rendering this page here. It's very easy in Django to paginate a list view. You just need to add an attribute to the actual class, as you can see in this page here. So paginating a list view, the attribute's called paginate by, and we just specify a number. That's the number we want to paginate by. So very simple to do that. One thing I'm going to do is update the model, because this is now a user films list view essentially. But what we can do is add a paginate by attribute, and we're going to set that to 20. Now this might normally come from your settings.py, or you might set a variable somewhere that determines how much you're paginating by. Let's just hard code it for now, and if we go back to our list view, you should see now that we only have 20 films on the page, and that's because we're applying this pagination. Now the question we've got is, how do we set up infinite scroll? So if we go along to the HTMX documentation, they have a page dedicated to this, and as you can see, there's a table row element with some data. Now what the gist of infinite scroll is, when you get to the bottom of the table, you should dynamically load up more data, as you can see there. Now the way to do this is we're going to wire up an hx get request. So a get request to this particular URL is what's happening here. And then this is the important part, it's the trigger. It's going to be triggered on the revealed event. Now the revealed event is kind of a special event that will fire when you get to the end of a current list essentially, and it will load up the next set of data, and then it will swap it into the DOM after the end of the target. So these HTMX attributes should only be applied to the last element in a list of data, and then when it returns new HTML data, it should have this applied to the last element in that data as well. So you can do this infinite scroll pattern using these attributes. Now, how do we do this in our code? Let's dive into that now. I think what's important to note is that we're always going to be returning more elements in a for loop. So if you look at what we've got now, we have this for loop of films in the film list.html. What I'm going to do is actually move that. I'm going to move that into its a dedicated partial, which I've already created, film list elements. Let's paste it in there and save that. So basically this elements file will be responsible for iterating over the films that we've got in our context and rendering them out. Now I want to include that partial here, and I'm just going to include it using the Django template tag, and it's going to be partials/film list elements.html. So that should include that. Let's check that that still works in the front end. And we do still get 20 films being rendered, so the partial is now working. Now what we need to do is we need to set up in our film list elements, we need to have the last of these divs that represent a film. So for each film we're rendering out a div, which is basically each line in this list. We need to wire up for the last one only the ability for HTMX and Django to return new data that's then swapped into the DOM. So what we need to do is, in the last iteration of this template for loop, we need to set HTMX attributes to fetch the new data. So let's see how to do that now. What we actually need to do is Django templates provide this construct called forloop.last, which tells you when you're in the last iteration of a for loop within a template. And we're going to use that here in order to set up the HTMX attributes if we're in the last iteration of that for loop. Otherwise, we're just going to set a normal div that we've got here. So all we're going to do is we're setting these attributes on a div, so only on the last iteration of that for loop should we do anything other than just an empty div. So the question is, what do we actually add to this for loop? So let's copy the div element, and we're going to set up an hx get request. Now the URL we're going to send this to is the film list URL. So we already have a film list, and if you look at the urls.py, the film list is actually the class-based view that we're paginating. Okay, so within views.py, it's this film list that we've said paginate by 20. Now by default we return this template called films.html. What we want to do is, if we're in the infinite scroll via HTMX, we want to return the partial instead with the next 20 films in our list. So we're going to see how to change the template that we're returning in a second, but for now let's go back to our film list elements and finish this HTMX component here, the attributes that we need to add. So we're going to send it to the film list element, and the trigger is going to be revealed as we specified in the documentation, or as we've seen in the documentation rather, and we're going to swap the returned response in after the end of the current response. And I'm going to set the hx target to be this, which means it will be applied to this particular element. So let's now see what happens. Now this URL is not complete because we need to actually send what page we're on so that the backend knows what are the next 20 elements to render. You can see a bit more about this in this documentation here. Basically when we paginate this data, we're going to send, we need to get the page number. Now we're going to do that through request.get, but we'll see that in a second. Now we've wired up this here. This is only applied on the last iteration. So now let's add django-htmx to our project. So you can use the pip install command, django-htmx. And once that's installed, what we're going to do is we're going to cross to views.py. Now we're going to use django-htmx to help us out a bit here. If it's an HTMX request for the infinite scroll coming into this view, what we want to do is we want to return a different template. We want to return the partial template with the next 20 films. This is a class-based view, and one of the methods you can override is get template names, and it's got a bit of auto-completion here. But basically what this is going to do is, under normal circumstances we want to just return films.html, so I'm just going to add that here, return films.html. Otherwise what we're going to do is we're going to use something provided to us by Django-htmx. Now there may be other ways of doing this, but I found this to be quite simple, and I'm trying to learn about Django-htmx myself. So it's a package by 𝗙𝗵𝗽𝗶, and you can see that what you need to do is add a few things to installed apps and the middleware settings. But basically the main thing it provides you that I'm going to use is that this middleware appends, or it adds an HTMX attribute to the Django request object, and you can use that, as we're about to do, to return a different template in the case of a request coming from HTMX. So let's add Django HTMX to our installed apps. We need to go to settings.py for that. So in settings.py, we're going to add it at the bottom here. And we need to also add the middleware. So we'll grab this middleware here and we can add that to the settings middleware settings. I'm just going to fire it in here. And there's absolutely no logic to where I've put that. Probably it could be at the bottom, but let's just stick it in there. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go back to our views.py, and we're going to now use the fact that we now have an HTMX attribute on our request object. So if self.request, and for anyone that doesn't know, in a class-based view, you have the self argument as a first parameter, and you can get the request object through self.request. And we know now that the middleware will add an HTMX attribute. This is a boolean. It's true if the request comes from HTMX. So if that's true, I want to return the partial, and that's going to be partial/film list elements.html. Otherwise, let's just return the normal template. Now the final step is we need to tell this list view what page we're on. We've got a paginate but we need to now tell it what page to look for next. So within our film list elements, we can add some attributes to the URL to do this. Now I'm going to cross back to the Django documentation here. This will all be linked in the description, but let's see what I mean here. So in the documentation here, if you look up here at the paginating a list view section, this is the template code, and we can see a few things that we can use. Now, the pagination utilities in Django, they add a page object to your template, and you can use this to get the page number that you're on at the moment. So let's say at the beginning it's page 1. We are now wanting to attach a get parameter that will tell the URL, and the get parameter is done like this. We want to make it the current page number +1, and we want to send that to the view. That's basically all we need to do in a list view here. So if I add a page attribute to the URL, this is a URL query parameter. All we need to do is set that to the page object that the list view will automatically put in our template. Page object.number. And we use a template filter called add, and we're going to add 1 to that. We get the page object that we're on, let's say 1, and then we add 1 to that, so then we will send the request with the page equals 2 to get the next set of data, and then when we get back that data, we will have page 2, and then the next one will load the data for page 3. And basically Django's views, the list view with this paginate by, this will take care of all the logic for you of amending the query set to get the right elements. So that's quite useful. Let's see now if we can run the server and test this out. If we cross to the page and we reload, we are getting an error here, so invalid block on line 4. Looking at this error here, I've missed out the URL template tag within this template, so let's go back to film list elements and we'll add the URL template tag, and we need to wrap the name of the URL in the quotes. So let's try that again, and we get back 20 elements. You can see now this is actually working. So if I refresh the page, by default we get 20 elements, but if I scroll down to the 20th, you see we stop here, but then very quickly we're reloading the data. And if you look at the back end here, you can see that we're getting these get requests coming in, and the page numbers are incrementing by 1 each time we scroll down. So that's basically it. That's how you implement infinite scroll in HTMX and Django. You can use the pagination utilities to do that. And when we scroll down past to 60, we're going to load the next 20 elements. So we get down to 80 and so on until the end of the list. So easy enough to do that in Django, especially with these utilities provided by the list view. The pagination is very easy. And we use Django HTMX, that extension, to make things a little bit simpler in terms of determining which partial to return. Now there are going to be a few things that are broken in this application now, because the pagination is not going to work, for example, when we go back from the detail view to the list view, because by default that's loading everything. Maybe this is an exercise for the viewer if you want to try and fix all of this. I think the main thing for this video is to get across how to implement infinite scroll using Django and HTMX, using pagination, and the template utilities that Django provides as well. Makes it very easy to determine when you're at the end of a list of elements, where you can then attach the HTMX attributes you need to get the next set of elements. So I think that will cover everything for this video. Thank you for watching. If you've learned anything or enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.